So Brother Richard has agreed to provide works of exhortation this morning. We thank him for that. This is Winfield Bible School 2019. The exhortation speaker is Brother Richard. His title for the exhortation is The Finger of God. The reading was Luke 11. Brother Richard, will you please bring us your words of exhortation?
Well, thanks, Brother Simon, and good morning, my beloved brothers and sisters. It's wonderful to be with you this week. It's a true blessing to be at Bible school, of course, and we have many fond memories of our time in British Columbia. We went back to Ontario, and we thought, let's go back to the West Coast. And 3 years ago, we went and started living in Simi Valley, California. So it's really great to be with you this week. And we have an undersigned scriptural coincidence this morning. It just so happens that our readings in 1 Kings at the moment, where we're reading about the divided kingdom, fits in really well with our theme for the week, which is the plagues of Egypt. You might think, well, what on earth has the divided kingdom got to do with the time that Israel spent in Egypt and then came out at the time of the Exodus? Well, there's an underlining theme in the divided kingdom narrative in 1 Kings 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on, into today's reading in chapter 13, in the time of Solomon, Rehoboam, and Jeroboam, in which there are a number of echoes. The whole story, really, brothers and sisters, echoes back to Israel in Egypt. And it's as if to say the problem of the divided kingdom was that the children of Israel have returned to Egypt, just like the generation that left Egypt in the first place. We know throughout their wilderness wandering that they returned to Egypt in their hearts over and over again. That whereas physically they came out of Egypt, it took another 40 years for Egypt to get out of Israel. They were, as it were, possessed with Egypt. And this is a lesson for us, brothers and sisters, how easy it is for us to drift back into Egypt without maybe even realizing it. We just learned about that brother in Cameroon has been released from captivity. Do we realize, brothers and sisters, that we have been released from the captivity of Egypt? And yet how easily we let ourselves go back spiritually into Egypt. And this, as we'll see, is the problem in the divided kingdom. So if you want to open your Bibles in 1 Kings chapter 13, the reading for today, in this chapter in which Jeroboam is found here at one of the altars that he's made, an altar which represents the false worship of the children of Israel that's being developed here, which is a false worship that goes right back to the time of the Exodus. And there's a few words here, brothers and sisters, that takes us links that take us right back to that time in Exodus. So, for instance, if we start reading here at verse 1, it says, "Behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of Yahweh to Bethel. Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings, and the man cried against the altar by the word of Yahweh and said, O altar, altar, thus says Yahweh, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you with human bones, and with human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day." This is the sign that Yahweh has spoken. "The altar shall be torn down, the ashes on it shall be poured out." Now that word sign there, brothers and sisters, is a very significant word. It's a word you might think which is fairly common in Scripture. Well, it was in the first 5 books of the Bible. It was a word used consistently in the time of the Exodus. It's the Hebrew word mopet, and it was used first when Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and gave the initial signs before the plagues. It's a word used in reference to the plagues being a sign, and it's a word that is very much associated with all the signs and the wonders that Yahweh performed in bringing his people out of Egypt. And yet, when we leave that context, that it's a word that's not used again in Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, all the way until now it reappears again in the story of Jeroboam and the divided kingdom. Once again, now we have a sign being given to the children of Israel, as if to say, you have returned to that period of time and you've gone back to Egypt, and I need to show my signs again to bring you spiritually again out of the captivity of Egypt. There's another example in verse 4. So it says in verse 4 that when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, seize him, and his hand which he stretched out against him dried up, so that he could not draw it back to himself. And the Hebrew, therefore, drying up is another significant word to do with the time of the Exodus, and, brothers and sisters, a fundamental theological point that comes out from the period of the plagues concerning the sovereignty of the one true God whose name is Yahweh. When God dries something up, it's an expression that he has power over all creation. The hand, brothers and sisters, is a symbol in Scripture of power, isn't it? And as if God is saying to Jeroboam, as he stretches out his hand and says, seize him, that Yahweh says, no, I am going to have the supremacy here. I am sovereign over you, Jeroboam. And he dries up his hand to show who has the power. And God does that consistently. He did it at the drying up of the earth after the flood. He did it in the drying up of the Red Sea to allow the children of Israel to go through on dry ground. The drying up of the River Jordan. It's a word that's always used, or most often used, brothers and sisters, in the context of God's sovereignty and omnipotence and power over all creation, that he can dry up the water, he can dry up vegetation, he can dry up the power of Jeroboam, and he dried up the power of Egypt. And so he is a God who is sovereign, a God who is the judge of all the earth. He can dry up the clouds so that they do not bring any rain. It's something, brothers and sisters, which we're going to see is emphasized in the story of the plagues, this power of God over all created things, to teach the lesson to Egypt and Israel not to trust in the gods of Egypt. And this is the same lesson now that's been expressed to Jeroboam, to trust in my sovereignty, Yahweh says. You'll also notice in verse 4 it says that when he stretches out his hand, he could not bring it back to himself or draw it back to himself. That's the same expression that's used of Moses, who of course his hand went leprous and he could draw it back to himself. It's the same Hebrew expression. Again, a reminder, an echo back to the time of the Exodus. If you go down to verse 6, where the king said to the man of God, entreat now the favor of Yahweh your God. Interestingly, he says Yahweh your God, not my God. And pray for me that my hand may be restored to me. You may even have in your margin a reference there to Exodus 8, 9, and 10, the narrative of the plagues, where Pharaoh uses that same language, where he says to Moses, after the plagues come, entreat Yahweh for me to stop the frogs, or to stop the hail, and to stop the locusts. So all of this language then, for some reason, goes back to Egypt. And in fact, that theme, brothers and sisters, those echoes are all the way through the story of the divided kingdom. It starts in the reign of Solomon. Just think in your head for a moment about the echoes. Solomon, well, he married the daughter of Pharaoh. He married an Egyptian, for instance. There's the one wife that is singled out, is the woman from Egypt. And a number of other connections between Solomon and Egypt. Let's have a look at one of them back in chapter 9 of Kings. And Solomon, in his heart, went back to Egypt. He multiplied horses to himself, getting them from Egypt. And we read in verse 19, you'll see the echo here with the building exploits of Pharaoh in the story of the Exodus. In verse 19 of 1 Kings 9, all the store cities that Solomon had, and the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem. So this is about him building many building exploits, including store cities, which is, of course, what Pharaoh did in the time of the Exodus. So Solomon then stands in the place, as it were, of Pharaoh. Who stands in the place of Moses? Well, Jeroboam does that. If you come to chapter 11, and kind of an ironic connection back to Moses, because he is going to morph into Aaron later on. But for now, in 1 Kings chapter 11, we see Jeroboam echoing back to the life of Moses. And we see that, for instance, in 1 Kings 11 and verse 28, which says, "The man Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph." And so Jeroboam grew up in the house of the oppressor, as it were. And we know that Solomon was an oppressor, just like Pharaoh was an oppressor, because if you look down in verse 40, you'll see an even more obvious echo with Egypt. In kind of a reverse of what happened to Moses, in verse 40, Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, just as Pharaoh sought to kill Moses. But Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Of course, with Moses, he fled from Egypt, but it was until the death of the Pharaoh. So there's echo after echo after echo, taking us back to the language of the Exodus. And we've got to figure out why this is the case. Now, the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, he becomes, as it were, the next Pharaoh. And you'll recognize this story in chapter 12, where the people of Israel come to Rehoboam, and just like in the story of the Exodus, they ask for their burden to be lightened. Remember, Moses and Aaron did the same thing. They approach Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go," and we know the rest of the story. So let's follow this through. Chapter 12. And this very famous story about them wanting to ease the yoke that Solomon had put on them. Verse 3. They sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came. So Jeroboam, here standing again for Moses and Aaron, came to Rehoboam. And in verse 4, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." Now the language here again goes right back to the story of Pharaoh. The idea of a heavy yoke here, that word heavy is exactly the same word used to describe the hard heart of Pharaoh. We'll also see the idea of the yoke later on this week is connected with the grievances of the children of Israel in Egypt. Now, when Moses and Aaron first came to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," what did Pharaoh do? Did he lighten their burden? He increased it. There you go. Perfect. He increased it. So, what does Rehoboam do? Well, we know the story. He went to the old men and the young men. He took the counsel of the young men, and he increased their burden, just like Pharaoh. So let's read that in verse 10. "And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, 'Thus shall you speak to this people who say to you, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus shall you say to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.'" echoing what Pharaoh did and made them go and gather straw now, as well as make the bricks. What else did Rehoboam do? Well, he employed taskmasters, just like Pharaoh. You read that in verse 18. It says in verse 18 of chapter 12, then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was the taskmaster. So he's just like Pharaoh. And then, of course, we have maybe the clearest echo of all back to the time of the Exodus in what Jeroboam does. We won't read through the section. You know very well what happens here in verse 25 to the end of the chapter, leading into where we started in chapter 13, where Jeroboam is at one of these altars that he made, and what he made in Bethel and Dan was what Aaron made after the children of Israel came out of Egypt, when Moses goes up into the mountain and they make a golden calf, which is what we're going to see later this week, was an idol that came right out of Egypt. The children of Israel had returned to Egypt, or they really never left Egypt spiritually. And here is Jeroboam making 2 golden calves, going right back to the problem of the children of Israel. Now, does anybody know who the 2 sons of Jeroboam were? Here is Jeroboam acting like Aaron. Who are his 2 sons? Well, turn over to chapter 14. It says in verse 1, he had one son here who falls sick. In verse 1 it says, at that time, Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, fell sick. And then his other son is mentioned in verse 20. And the time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years, and he slept with his fathers, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. So Jeroboam had 2 sons, Nadab and Abijah. And there's another echo. Aaron's first 2 sons were Nadab and Abihu. And the text here, brothers and sisters, is at pains to tell us that everything here is going back to Egypt. Another connection in chapter 14 here, and the interaction between Israel and Egypt. If you look at verse 25, in kind of a reversal of the story of the Exodus, you remember when Israel came out of Egypt, they spoiled the Egyptians. They took all the gold of the Egyptians with them. Well, this is reversed here in chapter 14, verse 25. It says, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the shields of gold that Solomon made. So they spoil the house of Rehoboam, who's now standing as if he is Pharaoh being spoiled, but this time in a reversal by the Egyptians. Well, let's have a look, I think, at one more connection, and that's in the Chronicles record, 2 Chronicles and chapter 12. Now this is the parallel. The title at the top of the chapter in my Bible says, Egypt plunders Jerusalem, exactly what we just read in Kings. Now look at Rehoboam's reaction to what went on here in 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 5. It says, then Shemaiah the prophet came to Rehoboam and to the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of Shishak, and said to them, thus says Yahweh, you abandoned me, so I have abandoned you to the hand of Shishak. Then the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, and notice the language that Rehoboam uses here, Yahweh is righteous. Now you might think that phrase, Yahweh is righteous, is quite common, but it's actually very, very rare, that exact phraseology, Yahweh is righteous. It's only used once before in the entire Bible. It's as if Rehoboam here, maybe subconsciously or unconsciously, is quoting Pharaoh himself. Let's have a look at it. It's keep a marker in Chronicles and turn to Exodus and chapter 9. Exodus chapter 9. Again, this is the only time before Rehoboam utters that phrase, Yahweh is righteous, that this appears elsewhere. And it's in the time of plague number 7, which, as you all know, is the plague of... You're going to learn the order of the plagues by the time the week is out. Plague number 7 is the plague of hail. This is Pharaoh's plague. This is the particular plague which impacts Pharaoh more than any of the others. And we'll look at that later on this week. So during that plague, look what Pharaoh says. It's in Exodus chapter 9. This plague gets to Pharaoh. And for a time at least, brothers and sisters, just like Rehoboam, he is humbled. So it says there in chapter 9 and verse 27 that Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron and said to them, "This time I have sinned." And using the exact same phrase as Rehoboam, Yahweh is righteous. So significant, I think, that Rehoboam unconsciously quotes from Pharaoh. Now, just before we return to Chronicles, if you go over to the next plague in chapter 10, just before plague number 8, which is the plague of locusts, it says in verse 7, chapter 10, verse 7, "Then Pharaoh's servant said to him, 'How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go that they may serve Yahweh their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined or destroyed?'" Egypt is destroyed. Now, come back with me to 2 Chronicles, and we'll see that same word to destroy is used here, but there's kind of a reversal of the story of the plagues here in Rehoboam's experience, where Rehoboam, unlike Pharaoh, who initially humbled himself but then hardened his heart, Rehoboam didn't go down that same route. He humbled himself and remained humble in this context. And so what did God do in chapter 12? We read in verse 7 or verse 5 that he humbled himself. And then in verse 7, after he says Yahweh is righteous, it says, when Yahweh saw that they humbled themselves, the word of Yahweh came to Shemaiah, "They have humbled themselves. I will not destroy them, but I will grant them some deliverance, and my wrath shall not be poured out on Jerusalem." So as if to say, I'm going to stop the plagues at this point. And there was an opportunity for that to happen in Exodus. After plague number 7, if Pharaoh had remained humble, I think the plagues would have stopped. But Pharaoh hardened his heart. And there's a lesson that's applied here in chapter 12 and verse 8. It says, "Nevertheless, they shall be servants to him." So they're going to be given a lesson here to live out. They're going to be servants to Pharaoh, "that they may know my service and the service of the kingdoms of the countries." So because of what they had done, because they had returned to Egypt in their hearts, they were going to become servants to the Egyptians to learn a lesson, to learn about service, which is the precise lesson that comes out of the Exodus for Israel. You can look at the law of Moses, which of course was born out of their experience in Egypt, and one of the overriding lessons that comes out of the Exodus is that Israel might learn how to treat other people, that they were sojourners in a strange land, that they were servants in a strange land. And so it should have taught them how to treat other people. You can read about that, for instance, in Exodus 23 and verse 9, one of the laws of Moses. So the same lesson of the Exodus is reiterated now in the story of Rehoboam. So again, brothers and sisters, over and over again, we get echoes back to Egypt in the story of the divided kingdom. Let's figure out what the lesson is then for us. And we're going to do that by using the New Testament and see some more echoes here. If you want to turn to Matthew chapter 12, first of all. So we left Jeroboam in 1 Kings chapter 13, where he is employed in false worship. A worship, brothers and sisters, which was kind of a mix, excuse me, a kind of a mix of truth and error, which is exactly what happens in the context of the New Testament. There is a mixture of truth and error here in, we're going to read about this in Matthew chapter 12. And what happened to Jeroboam was his hand was dried up. Well, in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus enters into the arena of false worship and encounters there a man who has had his hand dried up. Hopefully my voice is going to last the whole week. The man with the withered hand, and a withered hand is exactly the same idea as a dried hand. The word withered just simply means it dried up. So here is a man, and he's in a synagogue, which is a representation of all that was wrong with Judaism at this time. And we're going to establish this principle as we go through this week, brothers and sisters. The problem with the Jewish religion at the time of Jesus was it was no different to the religion of the Egyptians. It's the same religion. It had different names, and it looked like they were worshiping Yahweh, but no, it was the same pagan religion that the Egyptians indulged in. Same principles applied to their religion. So here is Jesus then in the parallel with the golden calves that were made by Aaron and then later by Jeroboam. In chapter 12 here in verse 9, he went on there and entered their synagogue. As the man of God entered the arena of Jeroboam's apostasy. And a man was there with a withered hand. And here is this man. And just as with all the miracles of Jesus, these people that he cured are object lessons describing the problem of the people at that time. This man represents what Jeroboam was representing. And when Jesus cast demons out of people, it represented the people that they were possessed with Egypt. And this man's hand is dried up. And he represents the problem with Israel, that they're just like the days of Jeroboam and the days of Egypt. And the question that arises here is about what is right worship. And of course, when it came to the Sabbath, the Jews had got it all mixed up. They missed the entire point of the Sabbath. So verse 10, a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they might accuse him. So here is the battle between truth and error. Now, in the context of that, we won't look at the healing of the man itself. You know the story very well. Jesus did heal this man. But let's look at what it goes on to say in the context. Here is Jesus then in this spiritual battle with the Jews. And a little later on in verse 22, there's a man possessed with a demon. And those who are possessed with demons represent those who are possessed with pagan thinking, possessed with worship of false gods. Even if the false gods of Judaism had a more subtle ring to them and had the appearance of true worship, but really were just like the gods of Egypt. So in verse 22, a demon-oppressed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, and he healed him so that the man spoke and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, can this be the son of David? And when the Pharisees heard it, they said, it is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this man can cast out demons. So we know this story again very well. Jesus is accused here of casting out demons by Beelzebub, who we know from 2 Kings chapter 1 was a false god. So they've got everything obviously all completely mixed up here of who Jesus was. Now, who were the ones here who spoke about Beelzebub? These were the scribes and the Pharisees. And another principle we're going to establish during this week, brothers and sisters, is that they are the exact parallel equivalent of the magicians of Egypt. This is one of the fascinating things I found out in my study of the plagues, is who were these magicians? Well, these magicians, brothers and sisters, who stand there with Pharaoh before the plagues and in the first half of the plagues, they were highly learned priests. They were masters of their literary traditions and rituals. Just think of the parallels with the scribes and Pharisees. They were Egypt's elite religious professionals. And one of the things they really emphasized was cleanliness and purity. They had many purification and protection rites, washings, just like the scribes and the Pharisees. They are the equivalent. They worship the same false gods. So again, our minds are brought back in the context here to Egypt. So what follows on then is very significant. Let's carry on reading here. We read up to verse 24. Look at what Jesus says then in verse 25. Knowing their thoughts, he said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste or ruined or destroyed, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. Interesting, isn't it, brothers and sisters? He talks now about a divided kingdom. It's as if the Lord here is bringing together all these threads of thought. Well, let's have a look at this in Luke's record. In our reading in Luke chapter 11, this is the parallel. You'll be able to see the false accusation of Jesus casting out demons by Beelzebub there in verses 14 and what follows. But Luke here adds a little detail which takes us right back again to the story of the plagues. So Luke 11 here and verse 19. Jesus, in responding to this false accusation, says, if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they will be your judges. But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come to you. That's the detail that Luke adds. If it is by the finger of God. Now that's a very significant phrase because it only occurs in the context of the Exodus. Jesus here is, as it were, ironically quoting from the magicians of Egypt. Let's just remind ourselves of this. You'll probably know the section well, but keep a finger in Luke, where we're going to finish our exhort in a minute. But turn to Exodus chapter 8. And in the third plague, the first three plagues, brothers and sisters, we have a contest between Moses and Aaron representing Yahweh and not just Pharaoh, but these magicians of Egypt representing the false gods and the false worship of Egypt. So it's the same contest that Jesus has with the scribes and Pharisees. Now, they meet their match in plague number 3. They can copy plagues number 1 and 2, the water turning to blood and the appearance of frogs. They managed to do the same with their magic arts, it says. However, they managed to do that. But when it came to plague number 3, the gnats or the lice, look at what they said. Exodus chapter 8 and verse 16. Then Yahweh said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so it became gnats in all the land of Egypt. They did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians, the scribes and the Pharisees of Egypt tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not, so there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And it's that phrase that Jesus chooses to quote when he cast out demons in his day. Because the casting out of demons was a parallel with what God was doing in the plagues. He was, as it were, casting out the demonology of Egypt and putting Egypt and Israel through an education process regarding their gods. So if we return to Luke chapter 11, and we'll end our thoughts here, brothers and sisters, what's interesting about the context here in which Jesus says, this is the finger of God, is that the whole context is about the divided kingdom. Just to have a look, for instance, in chapter 11 here, and verse 11, just before the episode regarding Beelzebub, it says in verse 11, what father among you, if his son asks for a fish, will instead of a fish give him a serpent? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? What father is going to do that? Which of you fathers amongst us, if your kid asks and they have an egg, say, no, have a scorpion? Well, that's what Rehoboam did. His children, as it were, came to him and said, lighten our burden. He says, my father chastised you with whips, I'll chastise you with scorpions. They asked for an egg, and he gave them a scorpion. Having said that, when it came to his own children, his own physical, biological children, it's emphasized in Chronicles that he was actually a really good father. It says in, we won't turn to it, but 2 Chronicles 11 says, of his physical children, he gave them abundant provisions and procured wives for them. And so it's interesting then that Jesus goes on to say in verse 13, if you then who are evil like Rehoboam know how to give good gifts to your children. Well, as far as his physical children was concerned, he did know. And then we get in verse 17, as we saw in Matthew, Jesus talking about every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste. A divided household falls. Reminding us of the division of the kingdom in the days of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, because, brothers and sisters, they have gone back to Egypt. And when that happens, there is ruin and there is destruction. And then one final connection in verse 21. You remember when Shishak, king of Egypt, came and spoiled the house of Rehoboam. Well, it's as if Jesus is thinking about that here in verse 21. Where it says, when a strong man, fully armed, guards his own palace, his goods are safe. But when one stronger than he attacks him and overcomes him, he takes away his armor in which he trusted and divides his spoil, which is exactly what Shishak, king of Egypt, did to Rehoboam. So, brothers and sisters, as we come now to our Passover meal, this, of course, is a reminder of our Exodus. It's a reminder, brothers and sisters, that we have been redeemed from Egypt. How easy it is, though, brothers and sisters, to drift back into Egypt in our hearts. Do we realize the extreme privilege we have, brothers and sisters, to have left Egypt? And it's not a physical thing. It has to be done, of course, spiritually. And so, as we partake now, brothers and sisters, of the bread and the cup, in memory of what our Lord went through to convince us to leave Egypt, to actually leave the land of sin and death, to let Egypt be destroyed in the Red Sea, and then come out of the Red Sea as a new person, adopted as God's son or daughter. And now here we are, brothers and sisters, in the wilderness of life. Let this meal be a reminder. Never, ever return to Egypt.